Well, welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, a senior communications consultant with C2G, and I'm speaking today with Thelma Krug, who is current Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. For more than 15 years, Ms. Krug represented Brazil in the negotiations of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and she was elected the IPCC's Vice Chair in 2015 during its sixth assessment cycle. Ms. Krug holds a PhD in spatial statistics, and her main areas of interest are climate change and the role of deforestation, forest degradation, and land use change, as well as national greenhouse gas inventories. Thelma Krug, welcome to C2GTalk.
Thank you, Mark, and it's really a pleasure for me to be here. And thank you also for the invitation. And I hope your questions will be addressed in a way that it can be helpful to those that are listening to us.
Well, I have no doubt. But maybe we'll just start with an easy one, or maybe not so easy. But what is the role of a Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change?
So basically, the vice chairs, they are also part of the IPCC Bureau. And this bureau is elected at every beginning of a cycle, right? A cycle lasts for 6-7 years. This one started in 2015. We went in 2022. So all members of the Bureau will be elected, 34 members representing regions. So we have a good representation for all 6 regions of the IPCC. So basically, it is to provide the panel with the scientific backing up that helps them to take decisions. So we also help in administrative issues. We also support some of the working groups that are created, like, for instance, IPCC has devoting a lot of attention to gender issues during the cycle, just to understand a little bit better how we can stimulate the participation of women, for instance, more women in the work of the IPCC. So our work as vice chairs is very much intensified during the approval sessions of the reports.
Right.
When we are asked to facilitate several hurdles, the difficult issues to negotiate are basically on the hands of the vice chairs to help.
And there has just been one as we're talking, and I know you've been pretty busy.
Yes, indeed.
So perhaps let's take a step back or an overview. How would you characterize the state of the climate debate worldwide and climate action, both in light of the COP26 meeting, recent IPCC reports, and other recent developments? How far is the world still off track to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade?
Well, first, Mark, I would like to say what is backing my answers is the reports of the IPCC. So I'm very much supported by the scientific findings in the IPCC reports. For the cycle, the contributions of the 3 working groups have already been approved, which is really great because now you have all 3 reports ready that bring a lot of contribution both to the physical science of the climate change, adaptation, impacts, vulnerability, and now this last one, approved just a couple of days ago, bringing us into the solution space, as I like to call it, on mitigation of climate change. So IPCC has a cutoff date for the literature it assesses. As you know, the IPCC doesn't carry out its own research, but it assesses the literature on the climate change in all its aspects. And for this last report, for instance, 14,000 pieces of scientific literature have been assessed, which is really amazing. And so my comments will be based on that. So the cutoff date was October 2021. So it was before the COP26. So we didn't have the possibility to assess the effects of the COP26 in the literature as well. So, but I will mention a couple of things that might lead us to think that has been some advances at COP26. So what I thought would be interesting to bring to this discussion is where do we stand now in terms of emissions and emission trends, right? So this is the latest estimates that we have in the report of a couple of days ago. And the news are now very good, right? Because in 2019, we had approximately 12% increase of the global anthropogenic net emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, relative to 2010. And this also represented 54% in relation to 1990. And if we take the average of these global net anthropogenic emissions from the period 2010 to 2019, this average has been the highest on the record when compared to 2000 and 2010. So these data are quite worrisome because one might think that nothing is being done, which in fact is not absolutely correct, because the world is just not in track to limit global warming to 1.5. But this doesn't mean that the world is frozen in terms of taking actions to combat climate change. So I think that it is not just being quick enough in those actions, but usually we have had policy measures that helped to enhance energy efficiency, has helped to reduce rates of deforestation, has helped also to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy. So I think that this is, I think, a message to answer your question. We are not on track. We are not being quick enough to be on a pathway that limits global warming to 1.5. However, we see that several policies and laws have been implemented and has been helping to reduce what could be even a more problematic increase in the greenhouse gas emissions.
So how serious would the consequences be of overshooting 1.5? Is there something special about that number, or generally are we just talking about increasing risks in general? And what are the risks that you see of overshooting that goal?
Well, I think that first, when we talk about overshoot, I think that we should also explain what overshoot means, right?
Right.
So for the IPCC, the way we look at the overshoot, it means that we are temporarily, not permanently, exceeding this 1.5 increase in the global average temperature above pre-industrial levels. So we look at the 1.5 as a long-term target, right? So this means that the 1.5 might be exceeded for up to several decades, but that does not necessarily mean that the 1.5 has definitely been crossed on a permanent basis. So it is still possible, though extremely challenging, to return to 1.5 by the end of the century. So technically, it is possible to temporarily exceed this 1.5 and bring the temperature back down by relying on carbon dioxide removal methods, for instance, that would remove billions of tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere and then would store it in geological sites, oceanic, and so on, land, and so on. However, the more we exceed this 1.5, the more difficult, the more expensive it will be to return to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And there is also a limit on how much these methods, the CDR methods, can achieve. So they cannot compensate for any degree of overshoot. So let's see. So some scenarios look at these pathways that limit warming to 1.5 via temporary overshoot. And typically, these scenarios lead to a temperature peak of 1.7 around the middle of the century before they return to 1.5 at the end of the century. So for the period of the overshoot, there would be a greater risk of the climate impacts associated with the higher temperature levels, for instance, on natural ecosystems, food and water security, extreme weather, and certainly if the period of the overshoot is longer. So some of these impacts could be irreversible.
Right.
And then, for instance, on certain ecosystems with low resilience, such as polar, mountain, coastal ecosystems, or by accelerating sea level rise. So the risks to humans increase, including the infrastructure, low-lying coastal settlements, and so on. So overshooting, depending on how long it lasts, how high it is, can have irreversible impact.
Can you say a little bit more about that? I mean, is this the same as the idea of a tipping point or planetary boundaries? And what do we mean by irreversible? What then happens?
Yeah, irreversibility could also mean that we are not going to be able to stop those things, right? So when we talk about tipping points is a little bit more challenging to respond, right? Because it means the point by which one system changes to another one and cannot come back anymore. The irreversibility we are talking here, in particular when we think about the polar, the mountains, is something that has impacts that are hard to revert back. So I would say that sometimes you have these impacts that are still able to revert back. It depends on the time you're considering, but I would say, yeah, I would say that.
Thank you. So you mentioned carbon dioxide removal, and I know the latest report said that deployment of carbon dioxide removal to counterbalance hard to abate residual emissions, i.e. the ones that you can't not emit or find it hard to emit, is unavoidable if net zero or emissions are to be achieved. At the same time, there's enormous governance challenges with carbon dioxide removal. What, in your view, are these key challenges to attaining the kind of levels of carbon dioxide removal that might be needed now, that are unavoidable?
Well, as I said, the CDR is unavoidable to really limit global warming or the increase in the average temperature, global temperature at any level. So we have to get to net zero. CO2 and greenhouse gases, as we are expanding, although these are much more complicated to have, for instance, methane emissions dropping to zero. But anyway, it's unavoidable that you have this net zero CO2 and greenhouse gas if you want to limit to a certain level of warming. However, you do have challenges to that, because some sectors, for instance, we talk about aviation, if we talk about industry, these sectors have difficulties. It's hard to abate some of the emissions, either because it is too expensive or because we don't have, let's say, alternatives that could let them have zero CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions. So the CDR is unavoidable in that sense that it can compensate some of these hard to abate CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. So this is why it's unavoidable. We don't expect that all sectors will be able to zero their emissions, but we have to find a solution, right? So CDR is, well, when we talk about CDR, we are talking about a range of methods and with different implications, with different potential side effects that you can have from each one. And obviously, when we are talking also about these side effects, it depends very much on the scope. It very much depends on the scale of implementation. So in the pathways that IPCC has assessed, it mostly relied on afforestation, reforestation. It relied on bioenergy with and without carbon dioxide capture and storage. It also relied on sequestration by the soil, direct capture of the air in the ducts, as we say in English. So, but these last two in a smaller scale, right? So, but even if you think about afforestation and deforestation, for which we know a lot because every country implement that, the issue is the scale that you would be doing this. And depending on the scale, you could have potentially food and water security, insecurity, I would say. You could have a conflict of land. Okay. Right? So that's it. So depending on the scale of afforestation and deforestation that you're going to implement, you can have food and water insecurity. You could also have a conflict on the land, especially for the indigenous peoples, the local communities. So you have also side effects because you're changing the albedo on the land. But also these are basically the afforestation and reforestation that could, for instance, enhance the capacity for removing the CO2 from the atmosphere. But you might have other CDR options or measures, such as weathering enhancement, such as fertilization, ocean fertilization, for which you don't have as much knowledge as yet. So they still require research and development for one to know better the risks. So each one of these alternatives, there are several, there is also biochar. So each one has a different mitigation potential. Each one has a time of permanence. Each one has a different cost. So IPCC assesses all these characteristics for these different methods and or options, as we could say, so that one would be more or less confident on the maturity of these methods to be applied, and in particular in large scale.
You've mentioned helpfully the difference between, I guess, nature-based approaches to carbon removal and more technological ones. So do you think that there's an inherent preference by people for nature-based solutions? Is there a sense that it would be better to do this with nature? Or maybe does that also create a risk of relying too much on nature and putting nature and technology into opposition, which may not actually exist? I'd be interested in your thoughts about nature and technology and how we navigate those different ideas.
Yeah, so it's to me it's unquestionable, and I think the IPCC makes that very clear that land-based mitigation options and adaptation options as well, right, are very critical at this stage for us to limit global warming. So what I believe, and again, the IPCC reinforces that point, is that we need to use all the potential that we have, right? So we are going to have to rely on technologies that are maturing. We have to rely on already matured technologies and also land-based approaches, rehabilitation of degraded land, restoring degraded land, reducing deforestation, agroforestry. So you have a range of possibilities that are land-based and which are very much associated to what has been called broadly by nature-based solutions. Which is, as we had in a footnote in the working group to report, is not a term that is internationally accepted. There is a debate in relation to to nature-based solutions, and in particular, because of this, of the potential misunderstanding that it could resolve the climate change issue problem, right? It has to be understood as being part of the solution, right? But it doesn't replace, absolutely not, the huge effort that has to be made in the other sectors, and in particular in the energy sector.
Well, one final thing I wanted to ask about carbon dioxide removal before moving on is there has been concern in the past stated by civil society and various groups that just talking and thinking and planning on carbon dioxide removal could create a moral hazard. It could, the idea that we could clean up the atmosphere might reduce the impetus to not put CO2 in the first place. How do you view that idea of moral hazard? First of all, is it fair? But is there a way of pursuing carbon dioxide removal approaches that reduces that potential moral hazard?
I guess there is. And you're absolutely right. There is this impression, you know, when you have these alternative technologies or technologies that are not reducing the emissions, right? But so you continue to emit, but you have a way out when you're using these technologies to remove the CO2. Removing the CO2 is something that we know a lot about, but removing greenhouse gas is something that is still, you know, being investigated. It's not mature enough for us to say that you have technologies to do that, right? Or methods to do that. So one can really say, well, then, you know, countries could continue to emit because there are alternatives to bring, you know, these emissions back somewhere. But is there a way we can go around this perception of the moral hazard? And I would say there is. In particular, if the governments bring upfront their targets to reduce emissions, right? So if there is an absolute transparent way to say, well, this is what we are going to do, and we are implementing all these mitigation strategies here, that could give some level of comfort, I would say, because then governments could say and transparently demonstrate that CDR would be used only in those cases where you have difficulties to abate, you know, the emissions. So all this transparent, obviously backed up by trust that we have to have with each other, would bring possibly, or would possibly alleviate this issue on moral hazard.
And that's a conversation I think we could have a whole separate interview on, of how you build trust between groups of society that are right now not necessarily having that trust. But maybe we can move on to another set of approaches which also has raised this issue of moral hazard, called solar radiation modification. This is the idea that you might find methods to reflect more sunlight into space and reduce temperatures like that. Now, the IPCC has touched on this in its reports, highlighting that they also could bring new risks, and there's a lot of uncertainty. At the same time, they are there as potential ways of reducing risk. Mm-hmm. So have we reached a moment, do you think, where the world needs to seriously consider these approaches, and how might it do that?
Well, you know, if we look at the stage of solar radiation modification today, and basically most of what we know comes from modeling approaches, right? So you don't have too much outdoor experiments. You have some, because as CDR, you also have different types of SRM. The most understood one, or the most studied one, is the stratospheric aerosol injection, the so-called SAI. But there are other approaches also in terms of, in particular on the sea, on the clouds, changing the albedo so that you would not have all the radiation, incoming radiation, going to, especially to protected corals, for instance. So we have experiments ongoing, small scale, localized for the modified cloud brightening, so that so some of these things go at small scale, would say that they are demonstration, but the SAI is the one that has to be deployed globally, right? Okay, so considering what we know today, so we know that these, that SRR can have a good impact in terms of including reducing some of the hazards of the climate change. So basically the high on the temperature, changing the precipitation, extreme events. So we know that. So yeah, from modeling studies, right? However, we don't have too many studies that demonstrate what are the risks and impacts on health, on crop productivity, on ecosystems, how it could affect, for instance, the ecosystems. So there is a lot still to be done to understand better these potential risks to people. So if you ask, is it not time for us to start thinking of that? Well, I think that research is always good, right? So, so we will not wait until we have a situation where you say, well, my goodness, how do we cope with this problem of increased temperature? In particular, you have overshoot scenarios, right? So when you have these overshoot scenarios, you're going to have an increase in temperature, and then how do you could cope temporarily with that, with these SRM methods, in particular SAI, right? As I said, because it's global. Now, what are the issues that we see that is recognized in the IPCC reports? Well, most of the research that has been carried out for in these modeling exercises or small experiments do not involve many developing countries. So we know that SAI, for instance, could have implications on precipitation patterns that would potentially affect some regions, and in particular the most vulnerable regions that do not have too much capacity to adapt. So this lack of engagement, a more universal engagement in these studies, in these research projects, might impair the ability of developing countries to use those results, also to guide policies, right? Mm-hmm. That might be needed in the future. So we see that, there are still several issues to be resolved in relation to SRM.
So there's a lot of different elements you introduced there. Maybe I could just grab one or two of them to dig a little deeper in. First of all, you talk about the need to learn more research. Now, there has been also groups who have opposed research altogether because I guess they just think it's sending this debate in the wrong direction. There are issues, obviously, again, of moral hazard and then some of it very practical concerns, about the ability to consult and whether they think you could ever do so fairly. How do you feel about this opposition to research, and how do you answer and again, this may come down to trust as well. Can you trust the people who would do the research to do this properly? So how would you answer those concerns, and how would you address them and suggest how you might go about research in a way that can address those fears of taking us in the wrong direction?
Well, I think that results also because of the lack of knowledge that we have in relation to this. We don't have too much clarity. There has not been, for instance, like a governance, international governance that could help alleviate this, or could help us initiate in a broader way, the study or the evaluation of SRM. We have pieces here and pieces there, like in the CBD that says, well, some research should not be outdoor, should not be carried out, but we don't have something really profoundly in terms of governance that would lead us, in particular for the SAI, which is global, right? That can have, distributional impacts that are unevenly distributed, as I mentioned, right? So you would not have really equity in that sense. So the fact that we do not know much, and it's interesting to know that some studies says that in the developing countries, when you talk about SRM, they do not object as much as the developed countries, possibly because they are the ones who are feeling more the effects of climate change, because they do not have as much ability to adapt to all these impacts and extreme events.
Oh, that is very interesting. Yeah, and not necessarily how some people have suggested it would go. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
So it's interesting. Some people also do not know anything about it. Right. So there has been a lot of questionnaire surveys in that direction. Most people do not know what this is, right? So if somebody comes and asks, depending on the way you ask the question, it might give the impression that, wow, yes, it's going to alleviate the temperature. It is going to be helpful for my agriculture. So the whole story is not there, right? So it's half of the way. So it's very difficult, Mark, at this stage, because there is so little knowledge, in particular in developing countries. And we do need to convey better, to communicate better these alternatives. Obviously, there is an intrinsic difference between, CDR and SRM. Before they were called, geotechnologies, they were put in the same package. But we know that CDR has a mitigation potential, right? According to the definition of the IPCC. However, the SRM doesn't, right? So, and that makes a big difference. You're just trying to, block out part of the radiation to alleviate some of the impacts of climate change, but it's not resolving the issue. It's not resolving ocean acidification. So there are many implications on SRM that I think needs to be studied a little bit further. But I welcome the research in some of these.
So there's, science can tell us a lot of things, can test assumptions and can then help us take decisions. But of course, people are also driven by many other considerations: economic, political, cultural, ethical, religious. I know that sometimes the debate around SAI is framed by some in terms of playing God. The relationship between humanity, nature, the cosmos has a lot of resonance in different cultures. So how does a policymaker, now having to take a decision whether to go ahead or pursue some of these approaches, balance all these different concerns? How does one, if ultimately somebody's belief is that this is wrong for various reasons other than science, how does the public debate go about addressing this whole balance of different things to consider as well as the science?
Well, this is why I think it's important to have some sort of governance for SRM. If not necessarily under, let's say, UNFCCC, but you could have a different governance that would allow governments to understand better the implications of this. The fear that might exist is that some governments might launch the SRM unilaterally or minilaterally, right? That could have implications to other countries. And And that's the issue, and especially for SAI, there needs to be a consideration for that and broad engagement, because as I said, that this is something that has to be taken globally. Another issue that I find important to bring is that SAI has an undesirable effect when you prematurely terminate it. So we call it termination effect. So we say that once implemented, it would have to stay, being implemented, especially the SAI, as we continue to say, by approximately 100 years, right? So there needs to be a commitment, a long-term commitment, because if you terminate the SAI abruptly, that could have the opposite effect. You would even warm very rapidly the temperature on the ground. So it is going to be a difficult decision. And this is why I think that there needs to be a forum where all this has to be addressed before it could be deployed.
And do you think, from your experience in this field of the past years, that it is possible to build, maybe not perfect, of course, but a broadly fair, inclusive form of multilateral governance that isn't necessarily dominated by the most powerful or the richest? Do you think it's possible to do that?
So that's my own sentiment on this, right? Because if we look now at the reports of the IPCC are bringing more and more of the social sciences into the consideration of its findings. So it is not too much carbon-centric as it used to be in the past, right? Or so gave that impression. So we talk much more about equity. We talk much more about reducing inequalities. We talk much more about a path of development that is resilient to climate change. We talk about international cooperation. We talk about issues that bring all these elements, that is bringing developed and developing countries close to each other, right? So it's inevitable that developed countries have to rely on developing countries to implement their mitigation options and adaptation options as well in an integrated way. And at the same time, to ensure this equitable addressing of climate change, would need to pursue the sustainable development goals, and so on. So this is a more holistic vision of how the world is expected to progress when you're addressing, climate change. So and I think that this is becoming increasingly more important. We are to limit global warming to 1.5, right? Degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. This will necessarily have to engage a much larger compromise from the developed countries, in particular, in terms of financing, of the investments, not only from the developed governments, but you have many other sources, the private sector, that has to have the confidence of where they are putting their money, right? So it's sort of a risk management type of thing. To respond more concretely, I have to have hope in the world.
Yes. Well, let me perhaps end on that note. There's such a difficult balance in climate communications and generally in addressing this topic between knowing and accepting how challenging the situation is and maintaining that sense of hope and agency. And you see it in every climate communication, including in the communications around this latest IPCC report, this balance of it's really difficult, it's really serious, however, there's still a way, and so forth. How do you personally, having been in this a long time, seen ups and downs, maintain a sense of hope, agency, optimism, while at the same time being fully aware of the deep gravity of the situation we are in?
Oh, well, being with the IPCC for such a long time, and so with inevitable proximity to science, and the way this science of the IPCC is produced, and it's produced, through years of voluntary engagement of authors, years of engagement of the technical support units, everybody that is engaged on this exercise voluntarily. So everyone, every single person in the IPCC is voluntary, but the secretariat, 12 people that, lawyers and so on, communication people and so on. So when you see this, right, and people devoting 5-6 years of their lives to science, this must give the world a message. There is hope, right? So they are bringing the science as it is conveyed by an enormous amount of pieces of scientific literature from all over the world. So that we are not saying that we are now biasing to have, say, only the scientific literature from the developed world. That's not the case, and the IPCC has procedures to avoid that, right? So that's my first consideration. Second, as I mentioned, I see that the world is moving. If we look at the indices, they're not quite there. They are not quite there. But when you look from the original ones, 2015, and then you look for those that have been, pledged before COP26, not considering even COP26, you see that there is an impact. So when you're looking at the indices that have been now submitted before COP26, you see that it has been progress, that has an impact on your capacity to reach 1.5 or below 2 degrees Celsius, right? So it's been gradually moving into that direction, and hopefully those pledges will be implemented in full. So when we are talking about this, we are talking again on the need for international cooperation and the engagement of the private sector, NGOs, also the civil society, to help put together the research needs, help to communicate, climate change. IPCC cannot communicate broadly. It does universally through its reports, which are very dense. So the civil society helps us to convey in a more simple language, the complexity of everything that's in the report, all the findings. So when I look at this from a holistic point of view, right? A private sector, which is doing a lot already. Also the banks that are coming up and trying to support, initiatives from countries, both in mitigation, adaptation. I think the countries will learn, and will have to learn quickly, that this financing will come more when you can indicate your needs with transparency, showing your ability to implement based on the science. So there is a lot out there, Mark, that makes me believe that because we are moving into a transformation, right? So you need to transition. The transformation, unfortunately, doesn't happen with the velocity that we need. However, when we say, IPCC said in this last report, if we have mitigation opportunities, technologies, measures that, if implemented, would lead us to have half of the emissions by 2030. Okay, very nice to say that. However, it also says implementing these mitigation strategies, it is there technically have a great potential, but also face different types of barriers. And these barriers are regionally specific or even locally specific. So you can have financial barriers, social cultural barriers, you can have environmental barriers, institutional barriers. So many things that need to be overcome because before you being able to fully have the technical potential of these mitigation actions. And this is why I think the partnerships, bringing all these partnerships, being, enhancing this cooperation among countries, having this inclusive governance that makes it much easier for governments included, to be able to implement and develop policies that are going to be understood and made it easier to implement. So this is my hope, Mark, and this is why I still think that this is giving me the strength to believe that this transformation will occur more rapidly than it would otherwise if we were not in the emergency of climate change as we are.
Well, I must say, Thelma, if we do, it'll be in no small part and perhaps overwhelmingly thanks to all the scientists who put in so much work, as you said, at the IPCC. And although it can be a little difficult sometimes to see the way through, I think that people may also learn over time to express an enormous gratitude for the work you and your colleagues have done to help us through this. So thank you so much, Thelma Krug, for joining us on C2GTalk.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.